It's my pleasure to welcome you all. Good morning. A huge thank you to all our members who are joining us from California. We know it's bright and early, and we're so thankful that you're joining us. I'm Parvati. I'm the director of our Advocacy Alliance, and it's my pleasure to welcome Anne Gingerich, the executive director of PANO. Anne Gingerich is with a firm belief in the abundance of resources available. Anne loves to don her visionary hat and consider what might be possible for PANO members, the nonprofit community, and PANO in partnership with various organizations, companies, and government entities. Anne approaches her work from a systems approach, engaging multiple individuals and groups to identify and implement collaborative solutions to community platforms. At PANO, she walks alongside community benefit organizations, increasing their effectiveness, efficiency, and financial stability through the planning, training, facilitation, and referral services available at PANO. Starting in her current position as PANO's executive director in 2013, Anne brought her experience as director of nonprofit resource network at Millersville University as adjunct professor with Millersville University Masters of Social Work program and as senior development officer at the Lancaster General Health Foundation, community service director of the United Way of Lancaster County, and the emergency social services manager of the American Red Cross of the Susquehanna Valley. Apologies if I'm mispronouncing any of this. Anne earned her Bachelor's of Arts in Social Work at Millersville University and earned her Master's of Social Work at Marywood University. As the owner of a beautiful Victorian home in Lancaster County, Anne enjoys cooking, rails to trails biking, reading, and good coffee. Thank you, Anne, for joining us today, and over to you.
Thank you so much. I'm excited to be with all of you. And I'm going to talk a little bit about PANO at the end, but one of the things I want to say to all of you right up front, PANO stands for the Pennsylvania Association of Nonprofit Organizations. And for everyone who's on the call this morning, you all have a state association that does the same thing that we do in your state. And I would highly recommend that you access their services. So when we get to the end and I tell you what we do, I will plop in the chat a link that you can find your own state association so that you can make the connection more locally to you. I am very proud to be part of the network of state associations. We do a lot of collaboration across the country, sharing of ideas, and all the things that we like to do on calls like today. We're a fairly small group, so I am going to welcome questions as we go through this conversation. I'm going to call it a conversation. We are here today to talk about Governance 101. We all have boards of directors that we work with. Some of you may be on the board of directors with the organization that you work with. What I'd like to do to kick off the conversation is you can either unmute yourself, hold on. You can either unmute yourself and answer the question of what is the best thing about the work that you do. And know that this is a question that if you want to involve the board in a strategic, more abundance-minded conversation, it may be one that you want to use with your board of directors. So I would just ask that you plop into the chat what is the best thing about the work that you do, and also mention the role that you play within the organization. And again, welcome that via chat or unmute yourself, and I'll just let it run for a little bit here. And I will tell you that the best thing about the work that I do is having conversations like this, primarily with groups of nonprofits around the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, in Pennsylvania. And so this is something, again, that you might want to check with your state associations. But in Pennsylvania, the nonprofit sector employs 15% of our workforce, or 807,000 people. And I keep saying to people around the Commonwealth, if we can get our voices together around a common cause, we would change the state systems that we work within, along with the communities that we work within. Yeah, that's awesome. Helping people get the help that they need, helping the patient community, making a difference in the daily lives of patients. Working with families. I think sometimes we get so caught up in the operations of our day that we forget why we are in the work, or maybe not the why, but we can forget about the higher level goals of what we're aiming to do. Thank you. Advancing research, patients getting better care. Again, this might be a question or a version of this question that you could ask your board of directors to help the board get more focused on higher levels strategies and excitement about the work that you're doing. All right, so moving on, we are here today to talk about Governance 101, to talk through some of the nuances of board versus staff roles in nonprofit work. I always say that when you've met one nonprofit organization, you've met one nonprofit. So there are nuances in the work that we do. And figuring out who is doing what at what point in time can be really helpful to get clarity around roles and responsibilities. There are 5 primary board roles and related expectations that we'll run through. And then I mentioned at the beginning that I'll talk a little bit about what PANO does, but know that your state association also does very similar things in the places that you work and practice. All right, hold on here. One of the things that PANO is licensed to offer is it's a whole body of knowledge called the Standards for Excellence. It's all the things that you need to know about board management and governance. And I like to reference the materials that we have through the Standards for Excellence courses, and you will see some references to that as we go through. Starting with the definition of what a governing body is. So the governing body is made up of elected volunteers who are committed to the mission. And that's, of course, the first thing that you're looking for as you're doing board recruitment. The primary roles, and we'll get into more of these a little bit later on, are to determine the mission. And I would add in here vision, mission, and core values for the organization, oversight of policies and procedures, making sure that you're adequately resourced. This can be a challenge sometimes, figuring out how to find the resources to run the organizations that we run, and then monitoring and helping to make sure that you're in a good financial position and able to perform programs. So those are the primary roles and responsibility of a board. When I do board training, I like to start with the legal responsibilities, the things that the government expects from a board of directors. One is the duty of care. And what this generally means is that a board of directors comes to meetings prepared for I would say, a fair and open discussion about issues that are brought to the table, meaning that they are able to review materials ahead of time, come prepared for discussion, and have some really great respectful debates in the boardroom about what should be happening and what the vision and the mission and the values of the organization should be. So the duty of care is making sure that board members are prepared and able to do their work of governance. The duty of loyalty has to do with this thing called conflicts of interest, and often organizations worry about conflicts of interest and try to avoid them. The reality is that we all wear many, many hats. And so, especially in smaller communities, you may end up serving on each other's boards or playing different roles at different points in time. The point here with the duty of loyalty is that when you are in the boardroom for your board, when they're in the boardroom for your organization, any conversation and decision making should be made for your organization and not with their other organizations and other hats on or interests in mind. So it's about being loyal to your organization when they're in your boardroom. And then the duty of obedience is making sure that all your programs and your funding are connected to the mission and help to further the mission and align with the values that you have as an organization. So those are the legal duties of care, loyalty, and obedience. One of the things I wanted to mention is I'm really open to questions as we go. I prefer to have a conversation. So if something comes up and you want to ask a question, please do that. I very much welcome that. All right, so governance is a group concept, and this is pretty important to understanding how boards and staff work together. So when a board is together and in the boardroom, that is when governance decisions are being made. And it's really the only place that governance decisions are made. So again, board members come prepared to conversations in the boardroom. There's fair and equal debate in the boardroom. Decisions are made in the boardroom on behalf of the organization. And then when the group leaves, they speak with one voice. And what that means is, and I love to use school councils or the school boards, at least in Pennsylvania, there's a lot of hot debate. So school boards will get together, they'll have a whole lot of debate, and then they'll leave the boardroom and everyone will speak to the media and talk about how they did not support the decision that was made in the school boardroom. And in reality, what should happen is that the board comes to a decision, and a little bit like the Supreme Court, once the decision is made, it is made, and it is sort of the law of the land, or the decision of the board, and the board speaks with one voice. So outside the boardroom, and this is where it can get a little confusing sometimes, individual board members don't make governing decisions. And I know that sometimes even with my own board, and often with Pennsylvania organizations who come to PANO for help, there'll be some conflicts between the board and staff, because the board will try to make individual board members will try to make decisions as a board member, and essentially, and I'm putting this in quotes, but boss the staff around outside the boardroom, when in fact they're not in that governance position when they're outside of the boardroom. So outside the boardroom, staff typically, when the organization is big enough, take the leadership role in calling the shots on the operations for the organization. I'm just going to hit pause on this because sometimes there's some questions around how this works or doesn't work. All right, I'm going to keep moving. You're very quiet this morning. Here's a slide that might be really helpful, and these slides will be shared with you after the presentation. It can be really helpful, again, to know the connection between the board members and the staff. And you will see on this slide that at every level, both the board members and the staff members are involved, usually in some way, or there's a connection. So in governance roles, the board is responsible, but the staff is involved. So as an executive director or founder of an organization, you might help to set the board agenda or work with the board chair in getting materials out. With administration, typically the staff is responsible for making sure that the work is being done and the operations are being performed. The board makes the what decisions, what are we going to do, and the staff decides how. The board makes the policy, the staff typically carries it out, and you see how this goes. So this can be this is a nice reference slide for high level conversations about who is responsible for what. Again, very open to conversation as we go through here.
I have a quick question.
Yeah.
I'm Kristen. I was wondering too about this. So I think one of the challenges that I face a lot is trying to determine, and maybe this is something that's just your board specific, where things need to be brought to the board for a vote.
And what are those things that need to be brought to the board for a vote?
Yeah, exactly. How do you kind of make that determination on when you need to bring it to a vote?
Yeah, okay. So I'm going to give you a couple examples, and I'm also going to say that with every organization, some of this needs to be discussed and agreed upon and clarified, so that you and Kristen, are you a staff member with the organization?
Yes, executive director, and I'm on the board.
Yeah, okay. So the question then for you to negotiate with your board is, are these types of issues? What the recommendation for governance is, generally for the board to give you, as a paid staff member that they've hired to administer the program, a lot of room to make operational decisions on a day-to-day basis. So I'll give you an example. If the board, and they should do this, works with you to either set and or approve an organizational budget, that anything that falls within that budget under a certain amount in particular, you should be able to go ahead and cut the check with maybe a board member's approval or whatever, but be able to make those decisions on a day-to-day basis. Grants, you should be able to write grants without people having to sign off on them unless the grant maker requires a board signature. Those are some examples that sometimes get taken to the board for a vote. And if the budget has been approved and you've been given the ability to administer the program, those are things that typically I wouldn't recommend that the board needs to approve. I don't know if that helps.
Yes, absolutely.
I'll give you another example. So in my organization, we have right now I have 7 staff, but typically it's about 5. And all hiring decisions are made by me. Now the board will approve salary ranges, right? And they will approve the strategic direction, but at the end of the day, they're not involved in making personnel decisions. Unless, right? And then I'll give you another example. There are some boards that might have a personnel committee because there's only 1 staff member. So it's helpful to have board members involved in a committee, but we'll get into how to work with committees that are focused on operational things as we go through this.
Perfect. Thank you.
Yeah, it's a really great question. So here we go. So when organizations are small, board members can often take on operational roles. And then it's important to understand what hat the board member is playing at what point in time. So again, when a board member is in the boardroom, they're wearing their governance hat and they're going to be making decisions as a board member. When they are on a committee or perhaps chairing the personnel committee, I'm going to use that as an example, they're wearing their operational hat, and in that place, they would look to staff for guidance and oversight and to make the ultimate decision. So getting clear and having the conversations up front about what hat board members are wearing at what point in time can be really helpful to alleviate and or get through some of the conflicts that happen. And I will say, I mean, this year in particular, we've had a lot of boards that are really wrestling with the relationships that they have either with each other or with their staff members and what that means. And I don't know what it is. Maybe there's something in the water, or, you know, it's also not unusual for this to happen, especially with small organizations. And then the other thing that happens is you'll have a small organization that maybe had 1 staff member and they're able to grow for any number of reasons. And the board members are used to having those wearing those operational hats, and they don't quite know what to do now that they're moving more into a governance role than wearing that operational hat. So it takes a lot of conversation. You're in relationship with each other, and relationships are messy. So know that is part of being involved with board work in a nonprofit organization. So there are board officer roles. These are not all required. You check with your state association. At least in Pennsylvania, this might be a national requirement. I should have checked on that before I did the training today. But what is legally required typically is a president, a secretary, and a treasurer. And I'll talk about why it's nice to have a vice president. I will tell you that one person can play more than one of those 3 roles. So a board president can also play the role as treasurer. I don't recommend it. It's better to have more people involved in decision making, and as volunteers, it can be a lot for one person to take up multiple roles. The board chair, I just want to say this clearly because I think it's really helpful for board chairs to know this. They are a leadership partner for the executive director or the person who is the chief professional officer for the organization. And it's really helpful to have a board chair that you can talk offline with, run ideas by, have their support in figuring out, you know, what to do. And in that sounding chair or that sounding board for the ED role, that's not a governing role. That's really a supportive role for the executive director. The board chair helps to set the agenda, if not set the agenda. Sometimes we'll make committee chair assignments and then works with staff to get board materials out in time. Having a vice president can be really helpful because that can be your leadership succession plan for boards. Because what can happen is board members or board officers can serve for a number of years and then they roll off and there's no one to take the place of that person, and it can be really troublesome for organizations to find people who are not just new to the organization, but suddenly they're plopped into a chair role. And it's hard, I think, to go from knowing nothing about the organization to serving in the role of an officer. So having a board or having a vice president can help you plan for years in advance, which can help with the stability of your governance and operations. Board secretary, it's kind of obvious, they take meeting minutes, especially in small organizations. It's really helpful if secretaries do actually take the meeting minutes and don't expect the staff to do that. I know at PANO, we share that role depending on who's in the room at what time. But that's what the board secretary does, and often will have to sign off on certain documents that are required legally, depending on what your state requires and the federal government. The treasurer, of course, helps to review the financials, can play a really critical role in helping to either set or review the budget, distributes the financials to the board. And then the way I've used, again, we have a small organization, I've used the treasurer as an extra check and balance for approval of checks over a certain amount. So, you know, if a check is written over $5,000, I'll shoot it off an email to him and say, hey, are you okay if we write this check? And that helps with our auditing process. So that extra check and balance can be really helpful on the financial side. Any questions about board officer roles? I know this is pretty basic, but sometimes questions come up. Okay. So I'm saying executive director, but there's many titles that people use in this position, sometimes a CEO, sometimes a founder, but whoever that chief professional officer is, typically and traditionally, and I'd like to start with this, the executive director is hired by the board to oversee all operations. And Kristen, this gets back to your question, right? If they've hired you to oversee all operations, then as much flexibility as they can give to you to do that, it's really helpful for you to be able to move without a lot of restrictions behind your movements. The executive director typically reports to the board, and it is the only staff member for whom the board has oversight. So sometimes boards get into this position of wanting to approve every single position. Again, the board should approve the budget for that and should talk with you about the strategy for why you might want to hire someone. But once another staff member is hired, they would report to the executive director within the organization. And that person then oversees and evaluates all other staff, unless there's program, you know, you can have the hierarchy, but the executive director is responsible for how the staff operates in general as they report to the board of directors. Typically and traditionally, the executive director does not have a vote in governance decisions. Now, having said that, there are organizations who have who have never done what I just described, in that they've had executive directors have a vote on the board. And their thinking with this, and I'll tell you the thinking behind it, is that it's one vote on the board. So it's not like they're going to change the direction of the board, and the bylaws could write in, they can't have the deciding vote on a board, but having a vote on the board can help executive directors feel like they have some ability to influence the governance decisions for the organizations. And again, the going trend is for executive directors to have a voting role simply because they're in the work every day and they have a sense of what might be most helpful and needed in the field. So that is what's coming, but typically and traditionally, executive directors have had this reporting role to the board of directors. Any questions about this? I don't know how many founders there are on this call, but sometimes when there's a founder, this can be kind of a nice way to keep founders involved in the sort of the governing part of the organization. And there's legal language that can be used to keep the conflicts of interest out of these kinds of governing decisions.
I'm wondering, Anne, this is Shelby, if you can sort of, are there any thoughts on, you know, staff also being on the board and how you should navigate that kind of differentiation, or, you know, if there's a fluid line between who can be on the board and who can't?
I will say typically and traditionally, staff have not been on the board with the exception of the executive director, because sometimes, and I'll tell you why that is. I'm not saying that new models can't be explored, by the way, we're all about that at PANO. when you have staff on the board, it can blur the line between the governance and the staff roles. So often what will happen is staff may not be on the board, but they're invited to board meetings and invited to have a voice in board discussions. I'll give you the example of PANO again. I invite staff to all of our conversations, and they are welcome to speak up and speak into the decisions that are made by the board. And the board's very interested in hearing from them. So there is a way to influence the decision without necessarily having a vote on the board. I don't know if that helps.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you.
Yep. All right. So now we get into committee work. So why have committees? Committees basically get stuff done, right? The nitty gritty work of the organization, particularly for those of us that run really tiny and small organizations, and some of the detailed work, and I'll use development, resource development or fundraising as an example. Resource development committees can go out, make the ask, create development materials without bringing all of that decision making into the boardroom, and get the board kind of pulled down from the higher level governance decisions that they should be making into the nitty gritty, weedy work of a committee. So really, if you can, having committees is a great idea. And another reason to have committees is it's a great way to test whether or not someone might be a potential really good board member. So you invite someone to join the committee. If they're involved, they're engaged, they step up and take the lead in something, that person might be the perfect person then to invite to join your board as a full-fledged board member. So it becomes a recruiting ground for the board, and you get some sense of how they end up engaging with your organization. So that's the why of committees. So now I'm getting into this idea of board level versus, and I maybe could even call it governance committees versus operational committees. So governance, board level committees or governance level committees focus on the 5 critical roles of a board. Board management, and we'll get into what that means. Board management is a huge role. That is absolutely a governance level committee, and it's something that should be focused on by board members. Operational committees are committees that focus more on supporting the staff. They operationalize the board decisions. So examples of these include executive committees, nominating committees, finance and audit committees. Those are all things that are focused on the governance level, board level work. And again, we'll get into what the board level work means, but those are helpful, really helpful committees, I think, for every organization to consider. And if you don't have enough people on your board, that's fine, but things to consider.
And I think there, are a few questions in the chat too, that people are asking about.
Thank you.
Mary's,
yes.
Yeah, Mary's asking, so committee members are not necessarily on the board?
Yeah, so thank you. That's a really fantastic question. For the governance level committees, the board level committees, those are typically made up of board members. Operational committees, so all these development committees, marketing committees, we have a public policy committee. Those are more operational, and they are fantastic places. We have invited and recruited a ton of people to serve on those committees that allow us to expand our group of volunteers that can help us do the work. So I hope that helps. When it's operational, more likely to have people from outside. There's nothing wrong. Again, every nonprofit is its own nonprofit, so there's nothing wrong with inviting non-board members to serve on the finance committee, for example. We have a non-board member on our finance committee or on a strategic planning committee. When you get into the board operational things, it's probably better to have board members on that, but this can truly expand the network. Thanks for calling out the questions in the chat. And then I think, Kristen, this gets down to I have personnel committee under the operational committee. That is absolutely operational focus. So if you have staff members, it can be helpful in a tiny organization to have a personnel committee and just make sure that they understand that at the end of the day, you would call the shot and who actually gets hired, and then the oversight of that person.
And
Yeah,
then
thank you. Thank you, Kristen.
oh, great. Awesome. You saw that in the chat.
Yes, so Christopher, the recruitment committee falls under, and we're going to get into more of what falls into board management. Board recruitment is a piece of that, and I have a recommendation for a committee that covers a number of board management roles. And yes, Mary, your question about should staff members ever be on these committees? Yes, yes, and yes. So I think it's always helpful to have a staff member involved in every committee. Governance level committees, I'll just use PANO as an example, but this is fairly typical. The staff member that's in those governance level committees is the executive director. So I will sit in on governance decisions or on finance committee. All of the other committees, any staff member really can staff them. And then when board members serve on those operational committees, they would look for leadership from the staff. So there's a flipping of roles when you're in the operational space. So caveats, get clear on who reports to whom for what. And again, sort of negotiate this for each committee, have really honest conversations with each other about what might work for your organization. Be really clear that committees should not make critical decisions on behalf of the board. And I call this out because in larger organizations, I don't know if this happens for you, but sometimes executive committees can end up making decisions on behalf of the board. And at the end of the day, every board member is individually and collectively liable for the financial and strategic health of the organization. So having a smaller committee make those larger governance roles or governance decisions is not a smart idea. Where decisions might be made by an executive committee might be when there is a grant that a funder says, hey, we need to have a signature on this. The executive committee might say, you know what, we're looking at where we're at. Yes, we would agree that we can make this decision on behalf of the organization. But try to avoid having committees make overall governance decisions. All right, so there are 5 critical board responsibilities, and one of them is in board management. And there's a number of roles that get played in board management. So I'm going to spend a little bit of time in this space. So board management starts with the bylaws. If you don't reflect on your bylaws from time to time, you might want to think about going back and looking at them, because when there is a question about how the board engages with each other and how they recruit committees and board officers, how long officers serve as in their officer positions, those are things that are all included in the bylaws. The other thing that we're starting to do at PANO is to, and with our members, is to begin to review we're reviewing our bylaws and trying to figure out how to make them more inclusive, and building in more power at every level within the bylaw document itself, because we think that inclusion starts at this really basic governance, with this very basic governance document. So this is the bylaws. Bylaws, if you haven't reviewed them for a while, it's helpful to look over them and have kind of a formal conversation within your board every 5 years. But having said that, you don't want to have to change them every year, because that can really bog you down if you're a small organization, to have to then re-upload them everywhere you need to re-upload them to, like the IRS, for example. All right, so here are the board roles and board management. Chris, you mentioned this earlier. I'm calling you Chris. Christopher, I mentioned this earlier, but so board recruitment and nominations is part of board management. It's helpful when you're going out to recruit for board members to have board expectations. So if you don't have a board commitment form, you might want to consider that. And if you have an interest in knowing what a board commitment form might look like, drop that in the chat. I'm happy to share PANOs. But it lays out for both current board members and also for those that you're recruiting for, what are the expectations? So how long are you expected to serve? How often do you meet as a board? Are there expectations around committee engagement? Are there expectations around personal giving? You know, all of the things that are involved in board work, having that laid out ahead of time can be a really helpful recruitment tool. And And then another role for the board to play in board management is board orientation. And this is a task that is often shared with the executive director in putting this together, but it's really helpful to have board members actually facilitate the board orientation because it's board member to board member, and then the board members can answer questions about what happens again in the board, but also talking about the programs that you have as an organization, the history of the organization. There's a number of things that you'll want to cover within board orientation. When a board's been together for a while, it's helpful to have the board do an assessment of itself and how well it's doing in the areas of governance that the board is responsible for. And I know I just did a board assessment with the board in Philly a while back, and they were a little startled at how people weren't aware of the mission or the vision, for example. And my comment was, that's just it's a place for them to focus on in terms of board training. So if people don't know or aren't connected to the mission and vision, for example, this can show up in a board assessment. Or if they don't know what it means to read a financial report, this can show up in a board assessment and provide the basis for some ongoing board training. Every board can use a refresher. I like this course about what it means to be on a board. Any thoughts or questions about the board roles and board management?
And we have one question on how often do you recommend boards meet?
Thank you. So I want to say the minimum number that we recommend, the minimum number of meetings that we would recommend would be quarterly, because I think it's easy for people to feel disconnected from each other if you don't meet more often. The not easy answer, this is not a structured answer, is what is it that the board needs? How often does the board need to meet in order to get the work done? So one of the questions that the PANO board recently asked was, what kind of board do we want to be? And then what conditions need to be in place so that we can be that board? So if we are wanting to be a more strategically focused board, we might want to meet more often to have more strategic conversations throughout the year. So it depends a little bit on what you need to accomplish. At minimum, I would say quarterly. Many boards meet every other month. I don't know that it's necessary to meet every month, although I know a lot of boards do, but it's not necessarily necessary to meet so often every year. And that can help recruit people if you're not kind of weighing them down with a lot of meetings. And then I will add, if you go with every other month and you get your committees involved in between, you might end up getting more work done anyway, because you have committees helping you do the work. Yes, and Christopher, say hello to Sebastian, and we're happy to share the slides. Global Genes will do that after this. All right, so board management is a big task, and it's primarily a board responsibility. One of the things that we recommend that you consider within your organization is having a governance committee that does all of the 4 things that we talked about on this previous slide. So I would say typically and traditionally boards talk about having a nominating committee. Well, nominating is part of board governance, but it's really only one of the 4 tasks, right? It's a nominating and recruitment, that's the first task, but it's not just about getting people on the board, it's making people feel comfortable once they join the board and feel like they have the information they need to do a good job. And then holding each other accountable to doing what you've said you're going to do, and if necessary, bringing in someone to do some board training. So that's our recommendation, is having a governance committee. It's a really great way for newer boards even to figure out how to organize themselves. So there we go. So we had a question that came in before the training today about how to handle well-meaning board members. Trust me, this is something that happens in every organization. You have people that get involved and either they're not engaged at all, or they're way too focused on operational questions. One of the things I would say is reference these slides for ways to get people focused on the governance role when they're when they're wearing their governance hat, and then to get them focused in the operational roles only when they're in a committee position. So getting clarity on what hat board members are wearing at what point can be helpful, I think, in this space where board members get too focused on operations. Often organizations will call their state association to help have us come in and provide that information so that a third party is doing that, and it's not something that you might have to do as an executive director. Board members who may not be engaged. It is okay, and I just want to say this out loud, it is okay to ask board members to step down. I know that they're volunteering, but at the end of the day, you need an active and engaged board. It's helpful to have healthy conversations about, we really want people who are engaged in this work. We see, and it can be polite, right? Like, we see that you haven't been involved for the last number of meetings. Can we talk about whether or not you're available right now? I mean, especially during COVID, right? We're all caught up with so many things, with our kids, with our parents, with our communities, with all that is happening around us. It's not always easy to focus on our volunteer roles, and it is okay to say, you know, it doesn't seem like this is the time for you to serve on the board. Maybe we can circle back with you in a year or two to see if life has changed for you. I know a lot of people, I know that the going wisdom for years and years has been that you should have term limits. This gets back to bylaws, that board members should only serve for maybe 2 terms of 3 years each, so for a total of 6 years, and then they automatically roll off. I will say that at PANO, we actually don't teach that, because if you have a really engaged board member who's doing really good work, we don't want them to leave. We want the history of the organization to stay in the boardroom with the work, so that we can carry on the story of our organization. So that's another conversation to have, is terms and term limits, and is that helpful? It is helpful to have terms so people know that they're signing up for 3 years, for example, but not necessary necessarily to have term limits. So again, I don't know if that raises any questions, but it is something that we have found helpful to keep people on the board as long as they are engaged and contributing, and then asking people to step down if they're not. So things to think about for board engagement. I often actually use this in facilitating conversations in general. One of the things that can be helpful to move board conversations along is to remember that conversations will hopefully not be finished at that moment if they don't need to be. So, you know, I think sometimes people try to keep going until full agreement has been met about every little detail. Not necessary. You'll have multiple meetings. You can continue the conversation. Consensus, I will tell you that my definition of consensus is that the group agrees to move forward in a certain direction together. It is not about agreement on every single detail and every single document on every single thing. So, like, keeping in mind what consensus actually is can be helpful. And I will say that one of the things that we found helpful in the PANO boardroom is that when we do have a heated discussion, and I'm going to say a free and fair discussion about a topic, and we've had them, especially, and I will openly talk about this, especially around issues, how we want to approach racial justice, which has become one of our strategic priorities. There's been some really difficult conversations, and so we've made the commitment to each other that if we do end up in a hard space, that we will have offline conversations within 48 hours. And if we aren't able to do that, then we choose to let it go. So this has been practiced by people within our board. It's been actually beautiful to see that play out. So again, sharing with you which things that have worked with us. Board work means that you're in relationship with each other, and it gets messy because that's what relationships are. Another thing to think about are board meetings. You know, what's on the agenda is what is important to the organization. So if on the agenda you, and I'm going to put this in quote, you only have committee reports, then the focus of the organization tends to focus on what has been in the past versus focusing on what is in the future. So think about that. So if you only have committee reports, then you end up focusing on what has already happened versus on what will be happening in the future. So one of the things that organizations use is something that is called a consent agenda, and that is where committees are committed to getting their meeting minutes to whoever is responsible for getting the meeting minutes out, getting their meeting minutes to the executive director, the board chair, the secretary, whoever gathers the board meeting materials in time for the board meeting, so that when the board agenda goes out, the board meeting minutes go out, the committee meeting minutes go out too. And then part of the board's responsibility in getting ready for a meeting is reading all of those minutes, seeing what's happening. And if there's questions, they can raise them at the board meeting, but it is now we know what each other has been working on between board meetings, and you don't have to spend time in the board meetings focused on the things that have happened in the past. And then you get to the board meetings and you can approve what is called the consent agenda, which is all of these different meeting minutes. One of the things that some boards do is to build an agenda item in every single meeting that focuses on the future in some way, on future strategy. It might be a discussion about a future program. It might be thinking about business in a different way. One question, one meeting agenda item that focuses on the future and on strategy, which can be really, it can make really good board meetings, actually, great board conversations. And then we actually say this at PANO, there are such things as bad questions. There are questions that they can incite, they can pull you backwards, they can keep you stuck in a particular space. So challenge each other about asking good, open, and generous questions that are focused on the future and assume the best about each other and about the organization. And then I just threw a couple questions on that I've already referenced, but example questions might be, what do we want to accomplish as a board? What kind of board do we want to be with each other? And then what conditions need to be in place for this to work? And that can help you come up with the answers to the question we had earlier about how many times do we meet? Well, it depends. What is it? What kind of board do we want to be, and how do we want to be with each other? And it might actually take more time because you spend some time each meeting getting to know each other a little bit. Any questions about that? I can't emphasize enough how much relationship building is important for having good board and good governance work, and to encourage that. All right, so the second role in the second critical role for a board next to board management is financial oversight. So there are a few things that happen with most organizations, and I probably should have put 3 first, but setting and approving the organizational budget is a really critical role for the board to play. It's helpful if the budgets are set against what happened the year before, just so you can see, are you stretching yourselves a little bit? Are you stretching yourselves too much? What expenses do we actually have? What do we want to pick up? Maybe we want to hire someone new. So how is that going to be financed? And it can be really helpful to, again, really think through what are the strategies that are behind and the assumptions that are behind the annual budget. The other thing that becomes pretty important, especially it's in every size size but it can be especially critical within a tiny organization, is your financial policies. So it's not considered an okay thing, and I actually agree with this, for one person to open the mail, process the checks, put the checks in the bank, enter the checks into QuickBooks. Like, having multiple people do those things it helps to create a check and balance within a small organization. So I try really hard not to touch the checks and not to have anything to do with them getting put into the bank or into QuickBooks, but then I'll look at the overall financial picture and do a review of those financials and get those over to the board. So if you want a sample internal control policy for a tiny organization, again, I'm happy to share that with you as a group, because I think it's an important thing for small organizations to have, all organizations to have, but it can be particularly challenging to make this all work in a small organization. If you're big enough to have an annual audit, the board should have a chance to look at that and review it. And same with the 990, which is essentially the annual tax return for nonprofit organizations. So that is the board role in financial oversight. Any questions?
I put one in the chat, but I'll just ask instead so it's easier. So when you're talking about having different people opening the checks and putting it in QuickBooks and all that, how can we do that if we are all spread out across the country?
How do people pay you?
I guess it varies, but a lot are checks. And
They
then
are by
our,
checks.
yeah,
Okay.
mostly, I would say primarily, and our operations manager receives those, puts them in QuickBooks and does the whole thing there. And she's in Florida, I'm in California.
Yeah, that's an interesting challenge because I usually work in Pennsylvania. So there's the caveat. So
Right.
it will create, I mean, it creates an interesting conversation to have for you. Like, I don't know if there's a volunteer in the area where your operations manager is. Perhaps that person can come in and open checks most of the time. Scanning things back and forth can be helpful for a second set of eyes. It's just helpful because there's so much question about, I always say nonprofits are owned by the communities that we serve, so we must be transparent about how all this happens. You have to get creative. What I will say is in the past, I've been in nonprofit work for 4,000 years, and back in the day, we had to have at least 2 signatures on checks. Well, we don't require that anymore. We use bill pay online, but what we do is we have this approval process. I mentioned this before, where the treasurer will via email approve a check over a certain amount. So I think some of the things can be automated now, given the systems that we have. That's what comes straight off the top of my head, Kristen. You're probably gonna have to get a little creative with that.
Yeah, something to think about. And I don't know if you're going to get into this, so forgive me if you are, but the investment policy section, can you talk about that a little more?
Yeah, so you know what I'm going to do, and Shelby and friends at Global Genes, I will send you some of these documents so you can share them with the group. So if you have enough money to invest, one of the things that you will want to talk about with your board is, do you want to set some guidelines around where you are invested in? You might want to align your investments with your values so that you're not investing in things that don't support what you ultimately stand for. That would be an example of something you want in the investment policy. You might want to have some policies around at what financial level will you invest. So, we want to invest, if we are able to make a profit or have a net income of whatever it is every year, we want to invest at least 3% of that into our investment fund, right? That's the kind of thing you might want in your investment policy.
And are these investments that have an ROI kind of thing, or?
Yeah, so like really big organizations, they will invest their money in a mutual fund, for example, that can pay off over the long haul. Essentially, you're putting money in the stock market, which maybe you don't want to do that right now because it's really volatile. But like if you have it in there for a number of years, that can provide some financial stability for you as an organization.
Okay,
And
thank you.
I have a question too, Anne, just going off of that. Could it also be a policy around, like a lot of our organizations invest in research or clinical trials or things like that? So could that be applicable as well, like an investment policy around how you're going to invest in research in your disease area?
I think so. This is under the category of financial oversight. I think what you're talking about is more programmatic related and where you choose to spend your funds. Now, I don't know that you would I don't know if you would call research a program. I probably would categorize that as one of the services or programs or things that you're raising money to do. So I think that might be more under a program policy versus financial policy.
That makes sense. Thanks.
Yeah. And then the other thing I'll just point out is reserves. It's really helpful. I mean, this really came up during the pandemic. It's really helpful to have what is called a rainy day fund. So like when something like a pandemic shows up and maybe you aren't having money come in through your usual sources, you have at least a little bit to fall back on so that you don't have to lay off staff or furlough staff and put your staff in a really difficult place. So I'm assuming you all know what reserves are, but that's what that means. Any other questions about financial oversight? Okay, so legally, again, I mentioned this earlier, having a periodic bylaw review. Now I have on the slide a very periodic. I will tell you that the PANO board is going through a review of our bylaws through a racial justice lens, because it's one of our strategic priorities right now. And we've had this big debate about, we think we should put our values right into the bylaws and name them right up front. And then there was this debate, well, if we do that, then what happens in 3 years if our values shift or our mission shifts? And the answer I think that we're coming to is, okay, if we change our bylaws then. So doing a bylaw review is important regardless of when and how you choose to do that. I named 5 policies up here. There are many others that I could talk about, but these are some things you might want to think about if you're doing fundraising. You might want to have a fundraising policy about what kinds of gifts you solicit, what kinds of gifts you accept, how will you recognize your donors, and what donors and who will you recognize. Again, there's a lot of equity issues built into our policies that we're really trying to think through now, but having some policies in place around these might be helpful. If you have volunteers, having a volunteer management handbook can be helpful. And then the other ones listed are fairly typical policies for you all to consider within your organization. Kind of straightforward. Any questions about what's on the screen? The other one I will mention, I should say, is if you do have paid staff, and even if that paid staff member is you, having a personnel policy can be really helpful, so that when you go to ask for paid time off, for example, you know what that is. And then when you go to recruit, you know what those things are. So that's the other one I should probably add to this list. All right, so fundraising. There are rules for the board to plan fundraising. Typically and traditionally, fundraising is primarily led by staff, but if you are a staff of one, you will likely lean very heavily on your board to help with this. So number one is one that is coming under some scrutiny as we look through our sort of expectations related to racial justice and equity, and is it okay to ask board members to contribute financially on their own? I think many people will say, even if it's $1 from each person, that can be helpful. But typically and traditionally, we do ask board members to personally contribute financially to the organization at a level that's meaningful to them. That is built into that commitment form that I mentioned earlier. Another thing that the board can do is reach out to their networks to talk about the organization and invite them to events. Ask them to contribute, all of those things. Serve as ambassadors, so forwarding on social media posts that you might put on. Sometimes boards help, again, in their operational roles. They will help to put together social media posts or do some outreach on behalf of the organization. And then the one thing that can be so helpful is when your board members can talk with potential donors, potential supporters of the organization about why they're connected to the organization. I find it so helpful when a board member will be like, here's why I'm the board member of PANO. I'm so proud to be part of this organization because of, XYZ. So that's another thing that boards can do. And then last but not least, it's so helpful to thank people for their gifts. And if you run out of time, this is something that your development committee, your board members can help you with. And it actually means a lot to your donors to hear from a board member of the organization. I'm hitting pause slightly because I'm going to keep moving here. I don't have questions. All right, strategic planning is another critical thing for a board to do. The governing role, just in general, is typically it's a way of thinking about the organization from a higher level strategic perspective. Staff does, I do this as the executive director as well, but I also have to be in the weeds every day and make sure the bills get paid, make sure I dropped off a computer last night after driving an hour and a half. They had to make sure that someone had a computer today. So like we all make sure that we have to get things done. So the board's role really is to help the organization not just get into the weeds, but to really think at a higher level, and to really set what the vision and the mission and those core values are for the organization, and to have buy-in to all of those things. And I would say more and more organizations are focused on core values as much as they're focused on vision and mission, and making decisions, strategic decisions about who they work with based on those core values. So if I am an organization that values collaboration, for example, and I try to partner, or I have a donor who insists on their way or the highway, I mean, that's not a collaborative way of approaching the work. So if you're able to walk away from that funding because of the lack of shared values, you may want to do that. So I will also say we work with a lot of businesses in our work at PANO, and many businesses are also focused on values and finding the connection that way. So having that connection to core values is really critical, and having the boards buy into that is really helpful. So strategic planning is, this thing that everyone says you must do, and I agree. I think looking ahead and figuring out what you can do over a longer term period of time is helpful. I've facilitated probably, I don't know, I'm guessing over 200 strategic plans at this point in my career, and I will just say that the environment changes so quickly that planning needs to be really fluid. So when I guide planning sessions now, I get the board to focus on the things I've just mentioned. So vision, mission, values, and then the top priorities, maybe 3, maybe 5. And then that's it. And then the staff and the board sometimes will do annual plans based on what they want to do in 1 year to reach towards those longer term goals. Because things change so fast that having a detailed 5-year plan, it's just not relevant, and it tends to not get used. What's really important in planning is to understand what is the board's role in planning and what is the staff's role in planning. Typically, the board is involved in setting these things I've mentioned, and the staff's role is about, okay, so how does this get implemented then? How do we operationalize this on a day-to-day basis? Both the board and the staff monitor the plan success. I mean, I usually like to suggest that the board and the executive director for sure, but maybe all of staff agree on, here are some metrics that we want to measure, and not a ton, because you can get really caught up in metrics, but here are some top level metrics that we want to measure over time, and you focus on whether or not you're accomplishing your mission versus, versus not just, and I'm not going to say this isn't important, but not just the number of people that you're reaching, but also what is the impact that you're having on people's lives. So kind of a mixture of both can be helpful. And then make sure, and this is really a board's responsibility as you're planning, do you have a plan that, do you have a budget that supports the plan implementation? Because you can plan away, but if you aren't able to support it financially, it's probably not going to work. Any thoughts or questions about planning? Okay. One of the things to think about, if you don't have a plan, you can still have some conversations in the boardroom about a particular initiative that you're thinking about longer term, and then so that again you keep the board's role and the staff's roles clear, and I can't emphasize the clarity about who's doing what. You can ask yourselves as a board, what can we do as a board member or as board members to put conditions in place so that we can be successful in our plan? So again, some sample questions that can help drive strategy conversations in your boardroom. Again, you don't need a formal plan, but thinking about planning and thinking about the future is a critical role for the board. All right, so this comes to the end of the Governance 101. Before I go into who is PANO, are there any, I'm going to stop sharing for a little bit. Are there any questions that you might have? The group has gotten tiny, so even more reason why you should speak up. Any questions that you might have about Governance 101?
I had a quick question. Sorry,
Yeah.
I was saving it to not run over. In regards to the fundraising piece, I'm curious. So for me, I was a board member prior to becoming the ED, and I'm a caregiver of a child with a rare disease. So I hosted a yearly fundraiser for the organization within my community. Am I still allowed to do that as a now paid staff member? Is there any conflict there?
There's actually no conflict. I
Okay.
think, and I say that because you're raising money on behalf of the organization, not on
Mhm.
behalf of yourself
Right,
or your child. Am I correct about that?
correct,
Yeah.
yes.
So I think as long as you're clear about those rules, even better that you can spend more time actually raising money for that.
Mhm. Thank you.
Yeah. Other questions? Okay, so you
have
are
a
welcome,
question,
Elena.
actually, about board size.
Yeah.
And moving from, we are a very small organization with a board president who's the founder and very much involved in the operational side of the organization. But as we look to grow, and he still wants to maintain control over the organization. So he wants to be very strategic about how we grow the board.
Mhm.
I'm just curious about the size of the board. What would be what's an ideal size based on the size of your organization?
You're gonna love my answer. It depends. It depends on what you want to accomplish, right? So tell me a little bit about your organization. Are you in like one county, in one state? You cover the country?
Well, we're technically we're in Tennessee,
Mhm.
but we're all remote. There's
Yeah.
sort of 5 core people but we're all still on contractor basis. There's no
Mhm.
staff
Got it.
position.
Yeah.
Okay. So, and we're in, we deal with a disease that's international. So we have
Got it.
it's a rare disease. It's international. So we've got international people who are involved. But we're really, we're really that startup organization still. We're in the process of needing to create the strategic plan, get the fundraising going. And the board has been it's been basically the founder, another parent who's been very uninvolved, and a friend of the founder who's the financial person.
Got it. Yep.
So we need to get the board bigger to grow things like the fundraising,
Yeah.
particularly.
So here are some things to think about as you think about growing the board. One of the things I would say is think about what skill sets you might need. So if you need, I'm thinking about who you have. If you need someone who, let me ask you a couple more questions. So among the contractors, is there someone who does fundraising now?
Yeah, and we're actually going to be working with a couple organizations to develop the strategic plan, develop the fundraising.
Yeah.
One of the contractors, she needs help on the broader scale, but it's good in operationalizing
it. So part of what some boards, and I'll say this, typically and traditionally, boards often recruit for, if a board member has a lot of connections, to bigger money, but it doesn't have to be that. It might be, maybe you have a younger board member who has a huge network that they could do some grassroots fundraising, crowdsource funding essentially. So I think it's a little bit about what are you looking for, and maybe you want to get people on who have larger networks. Maybe you want to get people on who can bring, often boards are like, well, we kind of need a fundraiser, so we're going to recruit for that, or we need a legal person. So skill set might be one thing to think about. PANO is looking to grow their board. Our board's maybe 30 people, which is insane, by the way. But we are statewide. We're in a big state. We want local representation, so it kind of makes sense for us. You see where I'm going with that?
Right.
So it really kind of depends what the bigger goals are. So the question to ask is, again, what kind of board do we need to be, and then who do we need to have to make that happen?
Right.
That's a great question, though. People want that ideal size, and I never give it to them. Are there any other questions before I quickly hop into what PANO is?
Yes, I have a question.
Yeah.
So a couple of them actually. So we have, we are a domestic nonprofit court for Massachusetts, and then we're a foreign nonprofit court for Ohio.
Okay.
Is it possible to be members of both the associations of both states, or?
Oh yeah.
Okay.
You just have to pay fees to both.
Yeah, just look those up though. Yeah.
I will, I need to send the link in the email that I'll send later so that you guys can get the links to the National Council of Nonprofits, which can link you to the different state associations.
Okay. And then the other one was, what is the best way to find board members? And
Mhm.
I say that because, you know, we have a patient advisory board, we have a medical board, we have a board of directors, but I'm not sure how to put this. I hesitate to open it up to the other two boards because I don't know if they would be effective, I guess, is really the bottom line. And I'm not exactly sure where to go. We're a rare disease, we're very small. You know, I don't want to just like put it out in the Facebook group. I don't know who I'm going to get. And I would love to, you know more about people that I'm considering, but I'm just not sure where to start.
Yeah, so a couple of thoughts on that, and I'm glad you brought that up. So this is part of the recording then. I will tell you that more recently people have been successful in finding board members through their LinkedIn accounts and their networks in that way, LinkedIn and their social media. Here's the caveat with all of that. Again, think about who do you need on the board, and then build in your interviewing process, your application process, questions that can get to people that are committed to your mission and people who bring the skill sets or whatever it is that you're looking to the board, if that makes sense.
It does.
So having a board application, and if you put it into a Survey Monkey form, it makes it easy for people to complete with questions about the connection to the vision and the mission, questions about what skill sets they bring, what interests them. That can help you weed out the people that might not be so good.
Great.
You have a sample of a board application form?
I sure do. I'm adding to my list of things to send.
That'd be great.
Yes. I'm sending you all of PANO stuff, by the way. Sorry. That's what you get. But you can adapt it.
Sure. Thank
I
you.
think too, it's just, and I don't know if you agree with this, I think it also depends on what your purpose is, because one of the things that I see a lot with our board is because our organization is meant for rare disease of primarily children.
Yeah.
It's a lot of the parents that you see even just on Facebook that are very, very involved. They're always in the Facebook group. They answer a lot of questions. They know everyone in the community. And usually those are the people that once they're on our board, they're the most active and they have so much passion and drive, even if maybe their career path isn't something that we necessarily need, you know?
Yeah. No, that's really good. And I will also add, like, so sometimes people get recruited to the board because they have a financial background, but they don't want to, they do that every day. So they actually want to do something else on the board. So I think part of what is interesting to ask, whether it's in, you get an application and then you have a conversation, like, do you actually want to do financial work or are you more interested in something else that we're involved in? And so having committee options for people to participate in can be helpful for that reason. Like I have someone on my public policy committee. He just called me 2 weeks ago. And he's like, I haven't contributed anything because I don't know what I'm doing. And I said, I don't know what I'm doing either, but we're gonna figure this out together, right? Like, so it's kind of fun.
Thank you. I appreciate the information.
Yeah.
Another question, you know, we're obviously, I think most of us seem to be US based, but we are, you know, appealing to an international audience for our organization in particular. I wonder about working with folks who are overseas, so they couldn't physically be present at meetings. But no, is that not wise? Should we keep it US based?
I think it's one of the things we absolutely learned during COVID is we can do so much online. So if you're able to coordinate a board meeting via Zoom or some other online platform, do it. Like, we can do this now, right? So I don't know, you can have people that are from other countries. I actually have someone on my board from Africa, so don't ask. There's a reason for that, but like, it's kind of cool. She'll call in from wherever she happens to be, Nigeria or Kenya or Ghana. So it's kind of fun.
Thanks.
Yeah. Okay, so I'm going to do just a quick, unless there's other questions, I'm going to do just a quick overview of what PANO is. And again, I've already told you to go to your own state association. Wait a second. Went to the wrong thing. I'm sharing my slides, right? Okay, so we're a statewide association, and I mentioned this here, a member of the National Council of Nonprofits. And I said earlier, the reason why I like to be a member of them is I get to talk to my colleagues frequently about what they're doing in their states, both around public policy and also just in programming and some of the new and creative ideas that are out there. So very strong, very powerful network. You can find your state association that way. We have our mission and vision there. I don't need to read them to you. I mentioned our values. We are really picky about who we work with now. Like when we're talking to companies that are not interested in one or more of these values, we just tend to walk away from them. I really like our values around all of them, really, the bridge building, the justice, the respect. There are times when I've met with potential, a lot of our donor base happens to be businesses, which is unusual, but it's just our model, our business model. But I've had people, corporations, business people who have talked over me. And I'm like, no, I have no interest. I don't, we need to treat each other with respect and really listen to each other and build relationships with each other. So I pretty much insist on that with anyone that we work with. Values become pretty important. Just wanted to underscore that. Our priorities are these three things. There's stories behind all of them, which I won't get into. So here are the things that you might want to check into with your own state associations. All of us do some type of online and in-person training throughout the year. These are really great places for you to connect with people in your own states and communities. One of the things that we have heard a lot, and maybe even more through COVID, but it's many people end up not feeling so alone because they realize there are other people out there doing work too. And so making the connection with other professionals is helpful. I mentioned the Standards for Excellence resources. We also offer this nonprofit help desk. I don't know if other state associations do, but if our members or others have questions that related to HR, this is a big one, HR, legal questions, or finance related questions, we have a whole network of legal people that can help answer those questions pretty quickly. We do a nice bit of lobbying, particularly at the state level, but also in collaboration with the National Council of Nonprofits at the federal level. And then we offer consulting services. And our top three requests for consulting services are board training, big one, similar to what I just did with you, strategic planning, and fundraising support. So many of my counterparts do all of these things. They may not do every single one of them. If they don't, feel free to reach back. Know that our materials are Pennsylvania based. So if there's any legally based questions that require state attention, we may not be able to help you, but we're certainly able to help in any of the other areas when we can. And I think that gets us to the end of our slides. So I'm going to pass this back to our, oh no, here we go. These are the top 5 reasons. Connection, discount, free access to all these things, and then advocacy alerts. All right, I am done. Thank you, Pavard. Thank you.
Thank you, Anne.
Yeah.
Thank you